Hi, my name's Miriam Bankovsky and I teach into the Politics, Philosophy and Economics degree at Trobe University. I'm delighted to join Rebecca and Marianne to organise this HES webinar, History of Economic Society webinar, also sponsored by the University of Lyon, on reproductive rights in contemporary economics and the history of economic thought. We heard last week from Marianne in the opening webinar a really interesting presentation on the work of the wick cells in Sweden and their contributions to a defence of birth control and contraception as part of the broader suite of population studies. And this week, I'm going to try to build on Marianne's talk by looking at the following topic. Alfred Marshall weighs in on the Victorian family limitation debates, principles for improved living standards and the politics of voluntary restraint. And in so doing, I hope that we'll be able to see some similarities with the Swedish case that Marianne discussed, similarities between Britain and Sweden at a similar point in time, but we'll also see some differences, and I hope to return to a consideration of some of those similarities and differences towards the end. I should say too that unfortunately I'm not joining you on the Zoom link because of an imminent death in our family, which will mean that I will not be available tomorrow night, which is when the webinar is scheduled. So because I won't be able to be there, I'm recording this in advance. If students of Rebecca's University of Lyon Masters class have questions that you'd like to ask or comments or feedback, please feel free to reach out to me on that address. Same goes for the webinar participants. Please do write to me and provide me with some feedback so I don't feel as if I'm speaking into the void. And any questions that you have, I'd be pleased to give it my best shot at responding to. For the French students, please feel free to write in French if you prefer. I do speak and write in French, not always very well, but I'll give it my best shot to reply to you in either bad French or good English. Please do reach out. And again, I'm really sorry to have caused inconvenience, but I hope you do understand. So in looking at the case of Britain and Britain's fertility debates or family limitation debates, I thought I'd begin with the key claims, just like Marianne did last week. I thought that was a really good way of getting to the nuts and bolts of the claims that were being made. So I think my key claims are as follows, and you will see them being developed over the course of the webinar. The first one is that in 19th century Britain, socio-political concerns about industrial poverty were articulated using the vocabulary of family limitation. At first it concerned agricultural poverty, but it soon developed into a concern with industrial, working class poverty of the factory families. So concerns about poverty were posed in terms of family limitation, which is itself an interesting issue. The second key claim is that controversy existed about whether working class families should access contraception and abortion. A third claim will be that a variety of different disciplines and people contributed to the debates in varied ways. Medical practitioners, the clergy, feminist activists, economists, philosophers, working class leaders, and they all contributed to the debates in varied ways. Often these were in conflicting ways, and sometimes they were in overlapping ways. Amid these varied contributions to the family limitation debates, we will study Alfred Marshall's view as an example of a very important modern economist, probably the most influential British economist of this period. And we'll study Alfred Marshall's views to see how popular economic methodologies and positions were informed by socio-political concerns, dominant moral views, and eugenic evolutionary arguments like those developed by Charles Darwin. I found it interesting last week listening to Miriam. At one point she noted that the Wicksel's arguments in favour of contraception were not challenged by economists on moral grounds, but rather for overlooking the economics of population. What I think we'll find here is that Alfred Marshall's views on the family limitation debates are actually posed through the lens of a study of population health and strength, but they're not inseparable from moral and socio-political values of the day. So the economic positions are not able to be separated neatly out from the moral here. Potentially a point of difference, or perhaps the economists of population didn't really notice the moral arguments that were implicitly informing their work. So those are their key claims, and I think there are some resonances with the key claims that Miriam made last week too. So briefly, the plan then will be to speak first to the question of what were the Victorian family limitation debates. We'll notice a couple of similarities and also a difference with the Sweden case. In part B, I'll turn to the economists. What were the economists' views of family limitation? And within this context of the economists' views, what were Alfred Marshall's contributions to the family limitation debates as a key and very influential British economists of this period? And in part C, I'll look at conclusions. What are the key characteristics of Victorian 19th century economics of reproduction? So that's the plan for today. So part A, the Victorian family limitation debates. On the previous slide, I popped up a handful of references that I used to inform this presentation. So what were the family limitation debates in Britain And what place did contraception and abortion have in these debates? Well, the substance of the debates concerned the question of whether and how families should consciously and conscientiously plan how many children to have. This question was closely related to the problem of trying to alleviate the poverty of families. In the early stages of the family limitation debates, this was in part around agricultural poverty, but into the 19th century, this became about the poverty of factory families. So the question was also whether poverty was caused by the family's poor decisions, or whether other structural factors conspired against families. For Rebecca's University of Lyon students, I'm also going to prepare another, I'm in the process of preparing another webinar on Avoras and Pareto's account of the family's responsibility for its own poverty, and in the context of their population studies. So in Britain, similar debates were taking place, but with a very, very big emphasis in the 19th century on a fairly new, a new phenomenon, which was the insalubrious and immoral poverty of the factory families. So the debate also turned on the sorts of strategies that families should incorporate into their planning. Questions like whether responsible families should be using birth control measures like contraception or abortion to enact their plans, or whether birth control measures should be avoided for stymieing the work of evolution. This was the sort of language in which the debates were prosecuted. So why did the family limitation or birth control debates occur? These debates began in the early 19th century in England, and I'm following Langer here. I've popped the references in a list at the end. So initially attention was focused primarily on the agricultural poor, and this led to works like Malthus, Malthus's treatise on population in 1798, which focused primarily on the limits of agricultural production in relation to population growth. But rapid industrialisation in the 19th century became associated with a new form of urban poverty and immorality in factory families. Miriam mentioned last week in the Swedish case, Wixell's concern with drunkenness in the working class families and to prostitution, linking this to immorality. And there are similar themes here in the British case. This new form of urban poverty is often described as interrelated with the immorality of factory families, with the question being whether families themselves are responsible for their poverty or whether structural factors have conspired against factory families. So the factors at play here, according to Langer, are in this earlier period of early 19th century, are the dislocations of the Industrial Revolution, the costs of the Great Wars, widespread unemployment after the demobilisation of the armies, a phenomenal increase in the size of the population, well beyond what Malthus had anticipated. And we'll discuss this later because Alfred Marshall will engage in a critique of Malthus's account of the link between production and population. Malthus didn't anticipate just how much population could increase given new productive methods and different methods of agriculture and production. But we also see a multiplication of the numbers of the destitute and periods of crop failure and desperate need. So these are the factors in the background context as to why the family limitation or birth control debates occurred and why they focused initially on agricultural poverty and later on industrial poverty. Maxine Montagna, who is Australian as well, like myself, she completed her Masters at London School of Economics on Malthusian discourse and the Malthusian League and the effect of Malthusian discourse on the presentation of political issues in the popular press and so forth. It's been very helpful to me. The debates were concerned, according to Maxine Montagna, with the relation between population growth and poverty, and they were informed by two key developments: the poor law reforms of the 1830s and 40s, from the old poor laws to the new poor laws, with the new poor laws coming in 1834, and controversies around birth control in the 1870s and 80s. Both of these developments also were a stimulus for the family limitation debates, since they did deal with poverty and the role of families in limiting their size through various strategies in order to reduce poverty. So I've dealt with what the family limitation debates were about, why they occurred, and now I'm going to look at the key elements of the legal context for the Victorian family limitation debates. So over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, the costs of poor relief had devolved to the parishes, and we'd seen a codification over time of the old poor laws. The old poor laws regulated the provision of what has been called outdoor relief, and that's when poor families didn't have to go into a workhouse or an institution to get food or assistance or clothing or money. No, rather the parishes distributed that to families without any requirement that they be in workhouses. And Marshall will say something about how the old poor laws were particularly bad at incentivising poor families to have more children than they could actually afford to feed. A bad incentive of policy that undermines family responsibility and aggravates poverty. So the old poor laws were replaced by the new poor laws in 1834. Requiring that those receiving relief now be housed in workhouses. So the unions needed to actually construct, and the parishes needed to construct these workhouses for people to live in, for families to live in. And Alfred Marshall will think that actually the new poor laws were better than the old poor laws because there was less incentive to have there was more it was more linked to working in a workhouse, the reception of aid. But he still thinks that the new poor laws, as he put it, worked in the same direction. They still incentivised irresponsible family behaviour because it still was meant that families could do better by having more children than by working hard. So from the 13th century to the early 19th century in Britain, so that's one aspect. of the legal context. We've got these poor laws regulating the administration of relief to the agricultural poor, and then to the new urban poor, through the old poor laws and then the new poor laws. And that will be of interest to the economists like Alfred Marshall. From the 13th century to the early 19th century in Britain, we have another element of the legal context that's relevant here. And that's that induced abortion was actually legal under English common law before the onset of quickening at 15 to 18 weeks, where you can begin to feel your the fetus moving inside. That's what the quickening is. Francome's account of abortion laws in the US and the UK has shown that this actually changed in 1803, when an attempt to induce an abortion became illegal at any point in the gestation in the UK, in Britain. So this change was actually driven by the medical profession, interestingly, and not on moral grounds at all, or not on the moral grounds of which, in the way we normally use that term. Abortion was considered a major danger to women's health due to the numbers of young women dying during the procedure. So the medical profession was really pushed to have abortion banned to save the lives of young women, and not because of any moral concerns about, the need to have this baby was God's will. The publication of birth control information was also illegal, and it violated decency laws. So that's key elements of the legal context as well that inform this debate. It's later in the 19th century that the debates will increasingly take on a moral aspect, forgetting that the banning of abortion was actually driven initially by concerns with young women dying. So, and who was it that participated in the family limitation debates? A variety of different actors from different disciplinary backgrounds, contributing a very different views, competing social, moral, political, and scientific perspectives. So it's a messy mix of views in this contributing to these debates. So as for social practice, we've got contraception was known and practiced in the late 18th and early 19th century. But how much it was used by the working class is open to debate. Some early texts suggest abstention and coitus interruptus, or the withdrawal method, among the lower classes, with the sheath or condom and vaginal sponge used by the upper classes. There's moral disagreement from a variety of sources about whether or not family limitation through contraception or abortion is okay. Unsurprisingly, the church consistently denounced contraception through this period, and abortion and infanticide as well. And the consistency in which they continued to do this throughout this period is taken by Langer to suggest that these really were techniques and strategies that were used by the lower classes, for otherwise the church would have not been too, concerned to insist on their being wrong. On the other hand, early pragmatic reformers and worker advocates like Francis Place, who was of a humble background himself, of working class background, a friend eventually of Mill and Bentham and Robert Owen. He felt that moral restraint and the idea that you should willingly choose to marry late or abstain from having sex. He felt that moral restraint was illusory. He thought that wasn't the moral issue at all. Starvation of handloom workers was really the moral issue. And later, Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant would republish similar pamphlets for the lower classes in the 1860s and 1870s, again viewing poverty and starvation as the moral problem and not a lack of moral restraint. So we've got competing views about what morality means here too, and what the moral problem is that needs to be addressed. Still others, Richard Carlile, a journalist who was influenced by Francis Place, went further to make a case for the moral importance of freedom of sexual relations and not just poverty reduction. There were few who supported Richard Carlile in this because they knew just how controversial this view would be. To make a case for freedom of sexual relations at this point in history was incredibly controversial. So even Place rejected Carlyle's views here. So there were also political governance concerns, shifting views on the viability of the old poor laws and their replacement with the new. I've mentioned already Alfred Marshall's views on these. There were also the political support of the pro-birth control view, tacitly afforded by influential persons. And Langer has pointed out that it's interesting that no prosecutions for publishing birth control material took place in Britain until 1877, even though Francis Place had done so, even though Richard Carlile had done so, even though Robert Owen had done so. It was only Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant who would be prosecuted as having contravened decency laws. Also interesting with respect to political governance is the view that of socialist leaders who had no truck with birth control platforms and were suspicious of any intellectual involvement in the affairs of workers. And Langer has an interesting account of why this was. And there's also scientific perspectives, the science of the day. As mentioned before, doctors supported banning abortion on medical grounds because too many young women were not surviving. This was the issue for them. Charles Darwin also argued, as we'll see, against both contraception and abortion for the working classes. As Pert and Levy have argued in 2008, finding an unpublished letter by Darwin refusing to provide testimony on behalf of Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant, who had asked him to speak to their case. Charles Darwin refused to speak to their case and instead explained why he felt that contraception and abortion for the working classes was wrong. Its use, he thought, would prevent the progress of evolution, which is a euphemism, if you like, for the view that those working classes who don't show moral restraint and who are unable to themselves regulate their own behaviour in ways that boost their health and vitality, well, those families that don't make the proper judgments are just going to die out, and that's the way evolution should have it. So having contraception and abortion for the working classes is not, for Darwin, a good thing, and he wants to limit it only to those in the upper classes who can afford it, since they can use good judgment and as to how to use it, and their survival is something that would have been already secured through the working of evolution. So now, having laid out that background in part A, looking at what were the family limitation debates about, what factors, why is it that they occurred, what was it that made these debates surface, and after having looked at what the various competing and overlapping contributions to those debates were along social, moral, political and scientific perspectives, we now should have a sense of the complexity of what I've referred to as family limitation debates in Britain in the late 18th century and across the 19th century, leading into Alfred Marshall's economic concern with poverty. So now in part B, we're ready to turn to the view of the economists and look at Alfred Marshall's contributions contextualized in relation to the views of other economists. I know you will have noticed on the previous slide when we looked at the different contributions to the debate, we looked at moral, political, social, and scientific, but we haven't yet looked at economic, the contributions of economists, and we'll find that it's not so easy to separate out the distinctly economic from the moral, the social, the political, and the scientific. We'll see that all of these vocabularies and perspectives, the messiness of the different disciplinary contributions to the debates actually do have some influence on Alfred Marshall's methodology and both methodology and evaluating aspects of his economics. So to contextualise Alfred Marshall's views, what positions did British economists, both recognised and unrecognised, assume in these debates? Well, Jeremy Bentham first broached the birth control topic in his discussion of improvement of the Poor Laws, and that makes a case for population limitation. Himes has argued that Bentham actually admits to the use of the sponge, although Langer feels the evidence is unconvincing. As for Malthus, in the famous treatise on population, Malthus argued that the root of family poverty lay with the lack of moral restraint of the lower class of agricultural workers. But Malthus did not advocate for contraception, and I'll deal with Malthus's arguments in a moment, since Alfred Marshall will both make use of those arguments but distance himself from certain aspects of them. James Mill and John Stuart Mill both advocated for birth control but sought to avoid controversy, so did not James Mill did not make his defence of birth control too obvious. James Mill and Bentham were both friends of Francis Place, J.S. Mill was actually apprehended by the police at the age of 17 for involvement in the Benthamite Circle's distribution of birth control pamphlets to the stricken handloom weavers who were basically starving as their jobs were replaced by industry. Annie Besant with Charles Bradlaugh was responsible for publishing pamphlets disseminating information about birth control to the working classes. And Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh were the first to be prosecuted under British law for contravention of decency laws, for publication of pornographic material. Now, Besant is not usually recognised as an economist, but according to norms of the time, but perhaps a feminist history of economic thought would, with more nuance, consider, the criteria for what counted as an economist and include Annie Besant. So she drew on Malthusian arguments to advocate in favour of birth control for the working classes as part of the Malthusian League. Again, I turn to Maxime Montaigne's thesis on this. Interestingly, The Law of Population, published in 1877, sold 175,000 copies by 1891, which is quite incredible for the period. So we have a series of economists, British economists, who are engaging with the family limitation debates through the lens of the economy around the question of poverty. So the elements of Malthus's view, which Alfred Marshall will engage with when developing his own views on family limitation and family behaviour, are that agricultural productive output will increase in an arithmetic way. And an arithmetic increase is when the difference between two consecutive terms is consistent. So in the example that I've provided you with here, production is increasing by 1 unit in each period. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So agricultural productive output increases arithmetically. For Malthus, this means the addition of only 1 additional unit of output every 25 years. That's what his measurements of output in relation to the progression of time suggests that agricultural productive output is arithmetic. The problem, though, is that the natural reproductive capabilities of humans, if unchecked by productive output, would allow a much larger capacity for population growth over a similar period. And he refers to this as geometric. So reproduction on the part of humans is geometric. And by this he means that the ratio between two consecutive terms is constant. So in the example that I've provided you with there, population increases here by a ratio of 1 to 2 in each period. So the issue then is that for Malthus, based on historical trends, population numbers would increase not arithmetically, which would be a growth analogous to the best case scenario for pre-industrial production, but rather exponentially. And if we look at the advocate from the working class, from a humble background, who was a strong advocate of birth control. He married young at the age of 19 to his wife, who was 17, and they had 16 children. So you can see the issue. So Malthus's analysis of historical population statistics suggested a capacity for a doubling of brute numbers, 1-to-2 ratio, every 25 years. And the conclusion then is that population growth would be continually checked by a comparatively lesser capacity for production, which really could only support the subsistence of a significantly smaller population. And what this means for Malthus is that families will need to become more responsible. There will be 2 checks on population growth. He says the first check is a positive check on the lower classes. And he means by this that the family's inability to provide proper food and attention to its children will spontaneously increase its mortality rate. And a large proportion of people, predominantly infants, would die in distressing conditions. A preventative check on population in the middle class would also be a way of stymieing population growth. And this is when responsible families use foresight to avoid having further children, decreasing the rate of population through choice. But this is not a defence of contraception, it's a defence of good judgment. So the working classes are basically going to die in distressing conditions, and the those with foresight are not. So what did Alfred Marshall think of this? Well, Marshall, writing now the Principles of Economics in 1890, a good close to 100 years after Malthus, felt that Malthus had not anticipated the effect of new technologies on agricultural output, and that these new technologies could massively increase productive output at rates that were capable of sustaining rapid and even geometrical population growth. So 3-field crop rotation, machines like tractors, this sort of technology. But Marshall still accepts and agrees with Malthus that the solution lies in voluntary restraint. Marshall thinks that destitution still arises in the new industrial towns, and he agrees with Malthus that it's a moral restraint, voluntary restraint, consistent with moral norms, as he puts it, that will be important. To understand Alfred Marshall's view on family limitation, we need to understand his family economics. And if you are interested, I have written a paper on this that's been published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics on his family economics. So there are 2 methodological approaches that we can see in Marshall's work, and he applies these to at least 3 regularities of family behaviour. I've discussed 4 in the paper, but 3 seem relevant to family limitation here. So the 2 methodological approaches are as follows. There's a descriptive aspect to his economics. So in this aspect of his economics, he engages in empirical study of existing forms of family behaviour across class. So he studies the relation between family income, family formation or the age of marriage, birth rates, infant mortality rates he takes as a proxy for life standard in my view, and education rates for children. But he doesn't just describe these regularities in family behaviour across class. He also evaluates them, and that's the interesting thing. This is an evaluative economics. He evaluates whether the class-based regularities are desirable and how we might improve them. And he proposes 2 principles to assess the regularities. The first is one of negative restriction. one must not enter into family life unless one can provide one's children with at least as good an education, physical and mental, as one had oneself. And the other is a positive obligation. One must enter family life. You can't choose not to. Just as soon as a sufficient ability to satisfy the first principle is achieved. So let's look at how this plays out in the descriptive studies of real family behaviour that he undertakes. Well, the first regularity he looks at are patterns in family formation. And he tracks the patterns in working class family formation as opposed to artisanal family formation, as opposed to aristocratic or upper class family formation. And he notes that working class families start earlier, at a younger age. Artisanal start a bit later, and working class and upper class families start later still. He doesn't find these patterns to be bad. Even though working class families have more children, he doesn't say this is a bad thing. He judges them to be acceptable because of the two principles that he discussed before on the prior slide. They satisfy the principles of negative restriction in the sense that working class families who have more children than artisanal families, because of the standard of living that their parents have enjoyed, they can more easily and quickly provide for their children at least as much as they themselves receive from their own parents, because the standard is lower. But in this way, standards will improve over time. So the artisanal family has become used to a higher standard of living than the working class, and so they're having children later and less children is also consistent with the principles of negative restriction. Note that this does involve a criticism of both old and new poor laws, because working class families start families earlier still under both old and new poor laws, which incentivise the having of children by the provision of relief. Marshall thinks he can say that the old and new poor laws are not good. Infant mortality rates, he says, as a proxy for life standard, are higher under both old and new poor laws. And although the effect of the new poor laws is not so bad as the effect of the old poor laws, they both still have bad effects. The second regularity for Marshall is a gendered division of market household labour in families. So the descriptive aspect of his economics involves having a look at who does what. And he finds mothers work mostly in the home, and fathers also work mostly in the market. He adds to this a claim without real evidence. A similar claim is found in Jevons, that the families of mothers who work within the home have higher infant mortality rates. Working mothers produce weaker children, according to both William Stanley Jevons and Alfred Marshall. And it's this evaluation, this then allows an evaluation. So we've seen the description, and now we see an evaluation. It's not good for mothers with children to be working within the market. They should be at home so that infant mortality rates will not will decrease. So this leads him to support policies to support women working in the home. The further extension of the Factory Acts, which were really for children, to limit children aged 11 to 14 to only half days in factories. He says the Factory Acts should be extended to include women with children, and Jevons agrees. He says something similar. And Marshall also defends gender-specific minimum wages with a wage for men sufficient to support a housebound wife and child. Jevons doesn't agree with this, but Marshall still thinks that this will be good for infant mortality rates. As for the third regularity, this concerns patterns of family behaviour with respect to education or human capital provision. So his descriptive economics studies how much working class families invest in the education of their children. And he notes that working class families don't invest as much as artisanal or aristocratic families in the human capital development of their children. Now he evaluates this according to the principle of negative restriction. It fails. It's not good. Marshall thinks there are 3 rules that should guide a family's investment in human capital, and working class families don't follow these ideal rules. These include A, that investing in one's children's education should take place if the benefits to labour productivity and higher faculties of the family exceed the costs. Mothers should educate general ability, consistent with the prior finding of the gendered division of market household labour in families, and fathers should educate specialised ability. So the content of the education girls and boys receive should match their future social roles. And Marshall thinks that the working classes are deemed to be unable to distinctly realise the future and discounted at a low rate of interest, under-investing in their children's education, and this is a moral failing. As for the relevance of this for family limitation then, well, we can see that family limitation is explicitly defended by Marshall. He does agree that poverty of working class families can be significantly reduced if families limit their age of formation and increase the age at which they choose to form families. He thinks the new and poor laws create or aggravate poverty. But he also thinks that working class families, if left to their own devices, should be able to improve their prospects over time. Because they are already, without the intervention of government policy in the form of old or poor laws, motivated to try to improve their children's standards of living. He also thinks government can undermine good decision by families in this sense. Governments shouldn't be providing incentives for families to have more children than the parents can adequately support. And government can also support families with education, those families who do not yet understand the true benefits of human capital investment, because he accepts that working class families might reasonably not understand this, having never experienced it themselves. Parents don't know. So this means primary education and the Factory Acts to limit working class children to half days in factories between the ages of 11 and 14. So this is a defence of family limitation. But he also equivocates too when it comes to the implications of family limitation for working class access to contraception and abortion. He doesn't think that contraception and abortion is the way to go. He agrees with Malthus. The family should avoid transgressing moral laws. But what's meant by moral laws then? Well, now we know from part 1 of our presentation. The clergy saw contraception in all forms to be immoral. All forms. So Marshall is effectively saying that family limitation is good for economic reasons because it increases living standards, but it should be done simply by working class people spontaneously deciding to get married later. What's also interesting is that Marshall felt there were some artisanal and aristocratic families who should be having more children than they did, because they could have easily, in his view, still supported those children to have a living standard at least as high as what parents themselves enjoyed. So we can assume that He wouldn't really have been in favour of well-off families alone having access to contraception and abortion, since these are the families that should have been having children. And in this he seems different to both Malthus and Darwin, who thought that good judgment shown by upper classes would permit them to access abortion in a manner consistent with evolution doing its job. We can see that, it's just an oddity in Marshall. So finally then, what can be said about the characteristics of Victorian 19th century economics of production, reproduction? Well, it's clearly concerned with the quality of population, its health and strength, its vitality, whether it's starving. It's concerned with poverty, and it's concerned with what it refers to as immorality on the part of the working classes. The traits Miriam mentioned last time, drunkenness, prostitution, and so forth. But the immorality also pertains to the having of children that one can't afford to feed. There are differences across the economists. Some view family limitation as something to be promoted through information disseminated to the working classes. Others, like Marshall, think that markets will reward families who spontaneously limit their procreation through good judgment, and that's the impact of evolutionary thinking on Marshall. We clearly see here how economic methodologies and economic position taking, the evaluation of descriptive findings, regularities, we can see clearly how these are informed by socio-political concerns, dominant moral views, and also eugenic evolutionary arguments like those developed by Charles Darwin. Thank you very much for staying with me until now. It's been a bit longer than I anticipated. And please do send through any questions and feedback that you might have. And more from me for the Lyon students tomorrow on Voros and Pareto and their respective studies of population in relation to family responsibility. Thank you and good night.